For those who are visiting, which there's a few of you, I'm in the middle of a series of homilies, so it's going to be like walking into the movie in the second act. But anyways, originally I had debated whether or not I would continue my educational homilies throughout the course of Lent. Usually I do a special theme for the season of Lent, but I really, really want to get this project done. So we're just going to keep going through what we're talking about these last few weeks, and that is the Catholic moral vision, where I'm going to be and have been addressing topics regarding morality, how to evaluate difficult moral questions, and the Church's teaching on social issues. And so this is part 5 of that discussion, which will probably be 8 to 12 parts, I would guess. And we've discussed the motivation for morality, which is happiness. That is the goal of morality, is achieving happiness. Next, we looked at the difference between objective and subjective reality, the reality that exists outside of us versus the reality that exists within the person. And then we talked about moral relativism, which is the idea that morality is changeable and individual and cultural. And then finally, last time, I talked about the natural law, which is founded upon 3 things: human nature, human reason, and divine revelation. And that Catholic morality is based on those 3 things, the natural law. Today, I want to begin applying what we know of human nature to morality. And so that way we can begin in the next few weeks to apply the principles that we've learned to individual moral situations and questions. But first, we need to understand human nature a little bit more. Unlike the other parts of creation, human beings were created with free will. And there's a common misconception that free will is simply the ability that we have to make choices. And that's not quite true. There are plenty of intelligent animals that can choose, that can make choices. Some animals can even solve complex puzzles. But that doesn't mean that they have free will. Free will is the ability to make moral choices, which is different. Animals don't make moral choices. Dogs don't become heroic or virtuous. They choose based on instinct to preserve themselves, their offspring, or the human who feeds them every day, and gives them, rubs on the bellies. But making moral choices is something that's unique to humanity. Not to say that animals don't have emotions, they do, just like we do in a lot of ways, but making moral choices is different. And so we have an element of freedom that nobody else in creation other than the angels possess. However, freedom is often misunderstood as the ability to do whatever I want, the ability to do whatever I feel like. When in actuality, freedom means that we have the ability to do as I ought. We have the ability to do as I was so designed, as we heard in our first reading. The difference between these 2 ideas of freedom is important, and it's vast, and it probably is the cause of a lot of the problems in the world today. If we all did what we wanted and felt like, we are presented with a rather bleak world with no rules, where only the strongest voice or the strongest muscles win. And it seems that is more and more the world that we live in, because we have abandoned the true idea of freedom. However, if used correctly, freedom develops virtue. It enables us to love. It positions us to experience lasting happiness. But when we use it incorrectly, when we do whatever we feel like, it can rob us of dignity, it can distance us from God, and it can cause us to fall short of the happiness that we were designed for. Free will also answers a lot of the age-old human questions like, how can an all-good, all-powerful God allow terrible things to happen? Why does he allow war, or starvation, or genocide, or slavery, or child abuse, or people getting killed by other people? If God really loves everyone, how can he allow these things, and how could he allow for the possibility of hell? And the answer to much of the evil in the world is a result of evil choices. We can't blame God for that. We can't blame God for the evils that find their origins in our abuse of freedom. God takes a risk in giving us free will, because the freedom that we choose, either correctly or incorrectly, it necessarily includes the freedom to reject God, to reject his law, to reject his will. And out of respect for our freedom, God neither forces us to make the right decisions, nor does he prevent us from making the wrong ones. Otherwise, we wouldn't be free. So, to answer some of those big questions, philosophical questions, in short, God has given us free will so that we can freely choose to love him back and to, in turn, love others as he has loved us. If we didn't have free will, we couldn't love. At first, going against the natural and moral law to achieve whatever it is that we want, it might feel like it's liberating. But if it leads us down the wrong road, then it becomes slavery. Sin is very addicting. It's sort of like a drug. And the more and more we live a life of sin, the harder and harder it is to get out of it. Maybe a person wants to change, but now it's very difficult to do otherwise. And I don't think that's free. Doesn't sound free to me. It is, as St. Paul says in his letter to the Romans, "For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I don't do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing." Living a moral life, however, it liberates us when we practice virtue. It helps us to know and to choose what's best for us. So let's begin to apply this concept of free will to morality. When we're talking about morality, we're talking about moral choices, meaning that these are deliberate actions. And involuntary action, while it has consequences, doesn't have a moral quality to it. A moral choice also has to have moral content. So, for example, the choice between vanilla or chocolate ice cream is not a moral choice, because choosing between those two things has no moral content. However, an evil intention can turn a neutral action into a moral action. So what if you choose the last scoop of vanilla because you know your sibling hates chocolate? Now we've introduced morality into it. It's a deliberate choice with moral content, and these sorts of choices affect us. Every moral choice we have makes us better or worse, or it contributes to forming our character, either a character of virtue or a character of vice, virtuosity or viciousness. They never leave us exactly the same. Every moral choice leaves us better off or worse off, more virtuous or less virtuous, closer to God or further away from him. But remember, for something to be a sin, we're going back to like second grade CCD here. For something to be a sin, it has to be serious, you have to know that it's wrong, and you have to choose to do it anyways, despite that knowledge that you have that it's wrong. And so with that in mind, our moral choices can be greatly influenced, greatly enhanced, or even lessened by our level of what we call culpability, which is a person's personal level of responsibility. And this is where I really struggled with writing and preparing for this homily, because this is where the subject of morality gets very difficult, because the culpability aspect of the moral action is subjective. It applies to the individual. It differs with each person and with each choice and with each action, which means that we have to evaluate each moral choice on its own and in its own context. And as I said way back in the beginning, 6 weeks ago, morality involves both objectivity and subjectivity. The objective moral law, but each of us experiences the moral law in a subjective way, in a personal way. And for some, this can confuse morality quite a bit. From the outside, it can sometimes seem like what might be wrong for one person could be right for another person, but that's not what we're saying. Rather, we approach morality with specific moral principles that then apply to the individual. And there's a difference there that we kind of have to understand before we begin talking about morality. And this is why the sacrament of confession is so important, because you can talk to a priest and he can sort of walk you through the situation and help you determine whether or not something you did was fully consciously sinful. And I bet a lot of you would be surprised as to both how rare and how common mortal sins are. Many things that people consider mortal sins are in fact venial, because of things that we'll talk about later. And many things that people think are venial, inconsequential sins are in fact very serious. When it comes to culpability, our responsibility regarding a moral choice, there's basically three different possibilities that you can fall into. The first is that you're simply not culpable. You are not responsible for the choice. You could not have reasonably known that it was wrong. And this is what we call invincible ignorance. There is no way of knowing, thus, you didn't actually choose the evil. And if you don't choose it, then it's not a sin. There can be no moral culpability. We can kind of put ourselves in Jesus' shoes in the gospel when he's tempted in the desert. And the first temptation is he's tempted by the devil to turn stones into bread because he's hungry. And of course, Jesus knows his purpose. He knows his mission. He knows that he's fasting, and that's the priority, and that this is an attempt by the devil to get Jesus to falter in that priority, in that intention. But if this were, say, a child being tempted to break a fast with some bread, or, the responsibility would be removed, right? You can't blame a child for eating when they're hungry, just like a baby isn't morally culpable for crying when it's time to eat. So that is one possibility, that you are simply not culpable for certain things. The second level of moral responsibility is that you are indirectly responsible for the action. Either, one, you acted negligently, or two, you should have known, but you didn't inform yourself. This is, believe it or not, it's called vincible ignorance. And this occurs when you either have some knowledge or you didn't know, but you could or should have known. There's at least partial culpability here. You can't always, plead ignorance in certain things. The classic example, the one that is used in every seminary classroom, is the hunter hears rustling in a thicket, but first he morally has to ask and be sure before he fires what's causing the noise. Is it a 5-year-old playing hide and seek, or is it a 12-point buck? You have a moral responsibility to know. There's initially ignorance there, but it can and should be overcome before a choice is made. Our gospel presents us with what could be an indirectly responsible scenario. Now, of course, once again, Jesus has full knowledge of the situation, so it's not like he could have gone either way on this. But if it was somebody else, the second temptation is to throw yourself from the temple, and God will command his angels concerning you, lest you dash your foot against a stone. That's a true statement. The devil is quoting Scripture. But Jesus knows better than to test God, and he quotes Scripture. What if it was somebody else, though? What if they knew the angels catching you Bible verse, but they were unaware of the testing God Bible verse? Perhaps they would have been less responsible for acting in that situation. The third possible status of culpability is that you are directly responsible for something. If the action is done knowingly and willingly, if an evil is directly chosen, then the result is full responsibility, full culpability. Think of Jesus' third temptation in the gospel and put yourself in his shoes there. The third temptation is to worship the devil and inherit the kingdoms of the earth. It should be apparent and obvious to most of us that that's probably a bad idea, right? To full outright worship of the devil is the type of thing that carries with it the weight of full responsibility for the action. So you can be completely responsible, partially responsible, or not responsible for a moral action. And with all of that said, we have to keep in mind that being culpable this only affects the responsibility in a moral sense. This doesn't affect the consequences of an action, which we can be held accountable to regardless. You can be held accountable for something that was less than sinful because of some sort of reduced culpability, but even when culpability is lessened or even removed due to insufficient knowledge, the damage that results from that action is still there, and it'll still affect you. The person accidentally exposed to explicit images is still affected by them. There's plenty of people who've been taught their whole life that an unborn baby is not a living person until they're born. They're ignorant of factual science, and that may reduce their culpability, but it doesn't reduce the effects of their decisions. Your actions or lack of actions can still be harmful even if you are not entirely responsible. We'll get more into that in the upcoming weeks, but today I want to finish by talking about things that can affect our culpability, and the first of which is knowledge. Like I said, we all were taught in second grade before our first confession that in order for something to be a serious sin, we have to know that it's wrong and do it anyways. So the first thing that can affect our responsibility, our culpability, is knowledge. Our knowledge helps to determine our level of responsibility, because the greater knowledge that we have about the rules of moral conduct, the greater our responsibility. For an act to be sinful, the person must know that it violates some aspect of natural law or moral law. For example, for a person to be culpable for missing Mass on Sunday, he or she must have first known that this was a serious obligation to begin with. And the degree of moral responsibility is proportionate to the level of awareness that we have about that thing. A priest is going to be held to a higher standard of moral culpability than most other people. The more you are aware, the more responsible you are. So, does this mean that we'd be better off not knowing? Why put ourselves through that? If responsibility is tied to knowledge, wouldn't it be easier if we avoided learning about morality? And the answer to that is no, because we have to remind ourselves that morality is tied to happiness. And that's the goal of life, to know and to love and to serve the Lord and to be happy with Him in the next life. When I was teaching this stuff about sexuality and theology of the body a few months ago, I had a shocking amount of people who, after I'd given the homilies, they told me, "Father, I wish I had known all this stuff before I got married or before I started dating." There was some regret to not being informed. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, but when it comes to morality, ignorance does not lead to happiness. So that's how knowledge can affect culpability or responsibility. What else? Well, a habit or an addiction can certainly have an effect on your responsibility for certain actions. A compulsive addiction leaves little choice depending on the severity of the addiction. And if the choice is taken away because of that addiction, then it becomes a non-moral scenario. And so, once again, we're talking about moral responsibility, not the negative outcomes of an addiction. Those are there regardless of how responsible you are for them. The third thing that can limit someone's responsibility or culpability is force or fear or emotional duress. I think this person might hurt me if I don't give them what they want, or I'm afraid my husband will leave me if I stop using birth control. If someone is in a position of power over you and then uses that power to their advantage to get you to say or do or not do something, then you have less culpability and your moral responsibility is reduced. It might not be taken away completely, but it's reduced. The fourth thing and final thing that can lessen our responsibility are psychological disorders, which is kind of tied to the addiction piece, but not all psychological disorders are addictions. So, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorders, social disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, postpartum syndrome, and depression, they can all have an effect on someone's choices. And in serious cases and in certain situations, people even feel compelled to do certain things that wouldn't be morally good, and that would remove at least some, if not all, of the moral culpability. And this is where, as you could probably tell by now, this is where the subjectivity of morality comes into play. Something can be objectively wrong, but the level of responsibility for that action can be reduced or even removed depending on the person and the situation. And only the person involved can know for sure which of these factors affects them and their moral choices. So when somebody comes up and asks me if something is a mortal sin, I can't answer that. Only they can. But I can help you get to that answer. And that's why, like I said, going to confession is so important. It helps us to evaluate each moral situation on its own within the appropriate context, which is a good reminder because now we're in the season of Lent, where we are all required to make a good confession before we begin the season of Easter.